What's up, you guys? This is Devin from Citrus FX Studios, and we're back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about the Canon 6D Mark I, and the reason we're talking about the Canon 6D Mark I is because the 6D Mark II is now rumored. But before we get to the 6D Mark II, we need to clear the air about the 6D Mark I. Now, a disclaimer: I have been shooting Canon for 10 years. I prefer Canon, but Canon is not the end-all be-all to camera makers. I like other brands. I've shot with Nikon, Sony. I've shot with also Panasonic, and I've found great things with these brands too. So this is not a Canon bias video. I'm trying to be as even and fair play when it comes to this rant that I'm about to get into with the 6D. Now, first thing we're going to do is go over the specs, and then we're going to compare this camera objectively outside of the Canon lineup, and then within the Canon lineup, and within the Canon family as a whole. So, when it comes to this Canon 6D, it came out in November of 2012. This was a late 2012 camera. It had a full-frame sensor. It had GPS. It came out with GPS. It was one of the first DSLRs with GPS and Wi-Fi. It also has 11 focus points, with one being cross type. It has a 20.2 megapixel sensor. It has 4.5 frames a second, and it also has 1080p full frame video. Now, with that being said, that's all it pretty much has for the mass of people. You know, it might have a couple of other things that are nice to have for a camera, but these are the main things that people are using and buying this camera for. It also retailed at about $1,900. So with that being said, let's first get into this camera as it relates to any camera itself outside of Canon. If it was just a camera off the basis of just being a camera, it's a decent camera. It has full frame. It was based off a whole 35mm full frame format. It was based off of the old school cameras. I mean, anybody who's shot in the last 30 years would appreciate this camera if they've never seen a camera like this before. If Canon had just came out with just this one camera, and this is the only camera that they've ever come out with, it's pretty much a masterpiece. But in the context of cameras that it came out in line with and around the time that it came out with, it's a horrible camera, in my opinion. It's just not a good camera. I find myself hard pressed to even find out why Canon even came out with this camera. Now, the reason Canon gives is we wanted to bring out a bare bones stripped down beginner version of a full frame camera, but a camera needs to be a camera, a good camera, off basis of you even bringing it out. You know, and Canon's been doing a good job in bringing out at least decent cameras that you can actually use, but the Canon 6D kind of kicks itself in the butt. I mean, if you have the time to sit and focus and, you know, take a picture, which is like in a studio, it's okay, but in any other situation, it is horrible. That 4.5 burst rate, that 4.5 frame a second burst rate is horrible. That's the first thing that I want to start off with, because you can't use it in sports. It won't capture the moment. And then you can't really use it in event photography as well as any other camera that came out around the time it was out, like the 7D Mark I, which was an 8 frames a second beast at taking pictures. You know, think about it. A good camera is a camera that's able to actually take pictures. And if you're not able to actually capture an image within that allowed frame, within the real life spectrum of time that the image actually happens, then if you can't do that, there's no reason why you should even have the camera in the first place. That's the first thing. The frame rate is just horrible for a camera that came out in late 2012. This is a time where the Canon 5D Mark II was an award-winning camera. 4 years ago, the 5D Mark III came out earlier that year with 61 autofocus points, a 6 frame per second burst rate. You see what I'm saying? Like it. Okay, so with that being said, the frame rate itself was already bad. Now, let's get on to the fact of the autofocus points as it relates to the entire line of Canon cameras. The 5D Mark II had 9 autofocus points with 1 cross-type focus point. The 6D comes out 4 years later with only 12 or 11 autofocus points and 1 cross-type autofocus point. Now, you might be like, oh, autofocus points don't really make a big difference. No, it makes a huge difference, because the thing about it is, if you cannot autofocus with that camera will not release the shutter. You see what I'm saying? Now, if you put it on manual focus, it will release the shutter pretty much anytime. But if you cannot autofocus that camera, it won't work. And manual focus is not even that good of a feature to have anyway. Like, it's manual focus is the most archaic way of focusing, period, because it takes all of the automation out of the camera, and you have to rely on yourself to focus the camera, and that takes seconds. You don't have seconds to take images in most situations. Even when you're in the studio, like if you're with a model who's been modeling for years, it's click, pose, click, pose, click, pose, click, pose. If they don't think that you're ready to shoot the next picture, they don't move to the next pose. But then on top of that, in the studio, if an advanced model comes in there, she's ready for you to go pose, click, pose, click, pose, click, pose, click. She has a muse. She has it's a certain amount of time where she's going to be ready. She's not going to sit there forever for you to take that one picture, because that camera that shoots, that 6D Mark I that shoots 4.5 frames a second, also has a buffer rate, and that buffer rate is based off of how many images you can take within a certain amount of time before it starts to load. So think about that. If you have these high quality raw files, which you're probably going to be shooting in the studio, you can't even shoot them that many times because the camera needs some time to process it, because it's a slow archaic camera, even for the time that it was out. Like I said, the 5D Mark III was out at this time. The 5D Mark III had 61 autofocus points, with 41 being cross type. You know how valuable that is to a photographer. You have 41 cross-type autofocus points. All of them are cross-type. That means that it can focus 10 times better than all the focus points on the 6D, period. Okay, that's the 5D Mark III. Well, you're like, well, Devin, that's the 5D Mark III. It's supposed to be a more advanced camera. It's 5D. 5D is supposed to be a step above. Okay, all right. 5D is supposed to be a step above 6D. Okay, even though the 5D Mark III came out before the 6D, the 5D series is supposed to be more superior than the 6D series. Okay, I get it. Well, let's go to the 7D, the Canon 7D. This is the dark horse of pretty much all the Canon full-frame cameras, because the Canon 7D is a crop frame sensor camera. But the thing about it is all of its specs seem to rival that of full-frame cameras. Now, a lot of people want to put a lot of weight on the full-frame sensor, but the full-frame sensor is not that different in this day and age than the crop frame sensor. If you have a good enough lens, you can get comparable results to a full frame camera with a smaller sensor 7D. So that being said, the 7D came out in late 2009. 2009. This is almost 10 years ago this camera came out. The 6D came out in 2012. The 7D has 19 autofocus points, with all of them being cross-type, and then the center focus point being like a multi-advanced cross-type focus point. With that being said, you can focus and actually activate your shutter that many more times than you probably could with the 6D, period. You see what I'm saying? Because like I said, if you're not able to focus on your subject, you're not able to take a picture with a digital camera at all. And 90% of the time, people are nowadays using autofocus points because everything happens in a fraction of a second. You don't have time. It's so practical, autofocus. It's probably one of the best features you can have in a camera today, period, because it's so practical that it's no reason to even have a camera if they can't autofocus, period. And you mean to tell me, Canon, you came out with a 6D with only 11 focus points with one cross-type focus point? That means I have to focus and recompose using that center focus point, because in most situations I use the 6D. I cannot focus, let alone having a telephoto lens with that telescopic, narrow ability to see. It's hard to focus with a telephoto lens if you only have so many focus points, because the telephoto lens moves a lot. It doesn't have the best image stabilization because it's such a big lens, especially the 70-200 with all its weight. It's so hard to focus, especially at 200 millimeters. And then if you have a prime lens with that shallow depth of field, you really need narrow, precise focus to focus on the eye of your subject. If you're using, it's just really, and that's just focus points. If we go back to the frames per second, go back to the 7D versus the 6D. The 7D has 8 frames a second. The 6D only has half that amount. 4.5 frames a second. You can't get that many images off. You can't. Like, it really bugs me, because Canon sold this 6D Mark I for $1,900 when it came out. That's $1,900 when it came out. Well, it's like $1,899 to be exact, but $1,900 when the 70 came out, it was like 1,600 plus tax or whatever, with or without lens. I don't know, but it was cheaper and it did way more as a camera on basis, not image quality, just a camera on basis, the ability to take a picture, way more than the 6D ever could do. You see what I'm saying? And for Canon to actually put this in a lineup of full frame cameras, think about what the word full frame is supposed to mean, period. It's supposed to mean professional on its base ends. Why? Because the 35mm sensor is based off of the old 35mm film format. And this is what all professionals were used to using back in the day. So when they brought it back in the digital era of the cameras that we use now, you get an equivalent focal distance, you get equivalent image quality, you get some of the highest image quality for the functionality of that camera, the speed and the usability. There's cameras with bigger sensors like medium format and all other stuff, but as far as usability and price, most people, like 90% of people, are going to use DSLRs and those cameras with the full frame sensors, because based off of the technology and how you can use it, you can get the best image within the time allowed it to get a image, period. That means sports photography. That means any form of photography. You can take a DSLR through any form of photography and pretty much get a good image. Now, with that being said, granted, some DSLRs are meant for studio, like DSLR, the 5DSR or 5DS, and all other cameras that are high megapixel. But at the same time, I could take the 5DS, a camera that came out, not too long ago, and still murderize the 6D, even though they say it's only for studio. Like, the 6D was supposed to be good for events, and it's okay for events. You can get away with it at a wedding or something like that. But the thing about it is, there's still precious moments of people laughing. There's precious moments of people crying. There's precious moments like the kiss, that if that camera can't focus and get an accurate frame, you just missed that shot, because it will not take a shot if it can't focus. And if you put it on manual focus, you have a extremely lessened chance of getting that image. I'm sorry, guys, I can't speak right because I'm just so fired up about why Canon would even bring this camera out in the first place. But let's keep going, guys, because the GPS, it's a nice feature for people who take landscape images, but for most people, they're shooting other people, especially in this day of selfies and client photography, where people want really good pictures. Even though we're competing against cell phone photographers and things of that nature, people still want professional photographers. They haven't lost their market yet. It's coming close, but photography is probably the most important than it's ever been in the past history of photography ever. In the past 100 and change years, photography has been the most it's ever been this day and age. And with that being said, you really need cameras to compete, and not just throwing cameras out there just to throw out cameras. We understand that Canon does not have the biggest full frame lineup in the world. Nikon had a bigger full frame lineup than Canon did when this camera came out. Canon, if not the most popular, is one of the most popular camera manufacturers in the entire world. What made Canon think that the Canon 6D was a camera you should ever bring out? Like, on the fact that it's a full frame camera barely makes it a camera that anybody would want to buy. Why? Because full frame cameras are more expensive. That's one. And then full frame cameras, they garner a lot more memory, which costs a lot more money in the long run, because if you're not shooting professionally, you're not gonna be able to make that money back. And then, so you gotta be rich to have the camera, and then you gotta, I don't, like, the 60 is just so, like, in the context of a camera that came out almost 10 years ago, the 1D Mark IV, the 1D Mark IV had more autofocus points. It had at least 45 autofocus points, It's just like, I don't understand. And it wasn't even a full frame camera. Like, the 1D Mark IV was like an APS-H size sensor, which is smaller than the full frame camera, but it could do like 10 times more than the 6D could do when it came out like 5 years ago, the 6D. It's just like, the 1D Mark IV came out around the time the 7D Mark I came out, and the 1D Mark IV is supposed to be the better camera. It was the top of the line at the time, and the 6D came out almost, it's just like, I don't like it's like a 5 year difference between these cameras, and nothing has changed. If anything, we've gone back in features. Like, what Canon should have done with the Canon 6D Mark One was they should have said, okay, we have the 5D Mark III that just came out. It's a little expensive, so let's give them an alternative. That's pretty much what they were thinking when they came out with it, but they should have went further and said, okay, now we already have the 7D Mark I that came out a while ago. We've had the 5D Mark II that came out a while ago. Why don't we just take that the capabilities of that 19 frame a second? Let's take the 7D Mark I, which is right under the 6D, based off of our naming system. We name the cameras, the lesser the number, the higher the tier of camera. So let's take the features from the 7D Mark I. We're going to skim it down a little bit on the frames a second because we can't process that much information, with technology that we have right now for this price. So let's bring it down to about maybe 5 frames a second. That's good. That's a nice tier. Let's go, let's keep the 19 autofocus points. The only thing we're going to do is put GPS, Wi-Fi in this camera, and we're going to make it a full frame sensor. That's all they had to do. And that's a decent full frame camera. A 7D Mark I with a full frame sensor and less autofocus, and less frames per second. And the reason you would have less frames per second, because I'm a technology major, I know it takes a lot of memory and a lot of processing time within a fraction of a second to, take in all those pictures. So you're going to have to bring the frames per second down to keep the cost down, But slapping a full frame sensor in there with all the technology that you already had shouldn't have been a major feat. It shouldn't have been something too hard for you to do. Like, I don't understand. Like, it's that's why I think the 7D and the 5D Mark II are some of Canon's best cameras. They're not only are the most supremely awarded cameras that Canon's ever came out with, but for their time, they were like great cameras. The 5D Mark II, it came out, took pictures of the first African American president. On top of that, it took some video for major feature films. It took, had some of the best 1080p video. It, for a DSLR with the shallow depth of field, all this stuff. It had a 21 megapixel sensor. From the 5D Mark I, that was almost double the amount of resolution that you had. That is a jump in, features. That's what you should do as Canon. But they were like, oh, the 60, one of our first premier full frame cameras that are on the lower end, let's just strip everything off of it. Let's not give it a TTL sync port that goes to the older light studios. Let's not give it that. Let's not give it a whole bunch of stuff that all the other D-series cameras have. Let's just make it, the Charlie Brown of the D-series of full-frame cameras and the D-series just in general, because the 7D, it's a crop frame sensor, but it rivals most, if not all, the full-frame sensors. The 6D, which is a full-frame censored camera, it doesn't... I don't understand. So I know I got off a little bit, guys. Based off the time this came out, the 5D Mark III was leagues above it, even though it's supposed to be better. The 5D Mark II I think is still a better camera than the 6D, in my opinion, and it came out 4 years before. So I don't time is not really a factor here, which Canon was thinking about, which doesn't make sense. Money wise, it came out right around the price it shouldn't have come out at. I think this camera is worth $1,000 when it came out, because it wasn't much better than the 7D, and the 7D came out at $1,600. This came out at $1,900, and it didn't have $300 more worth of features to it, like $400-$500 more worth of features to it. It was just, I don't understand. It just made me feel like, as a person who invests in Canon, it made me feel like I was not worth it. And they did the same thing with the 7D Mark II versus the 1DX. The 7D Mark II pretty much is a clone of the 1DX. Focus system, modes, all this other stuff. And how come we're paying? How come Canon professionals are paying $6,000 for the 1DX, and then you come out with the 7D Mark II, and it's only like less than $2,000. Like what sense does that make? And it's only like a 3-4 year difference between the cameras. But then you come out with the 6D, which came out in 2012, that is barely different from the 5D Mark II, which came out in 2008 as an award-winning camera. It's like, what are you doing, Canon? Come on. Like, I didn't like. And the reason I make this rant is because, again, guys, I've been shooting with Canon for 10 years. Like, when you invest in lenses and the camera bodies, you start to invest in the brand, because everything kind of matches itself. Everything works with that camera. Everything works correctly, and you really don't want to branch out to third party because everything works correctly when you buy lenses and stuff, all this other stuff for the camera. So, with that being said, it makes it really frustrating when Canon does that little retcon on the 1DX Mark I with the 7D Mark II, and then they retcon the 6D with every other camera that they brought out. It's just like, I don't get it, man.